The moment the gavel fell, the chamber absorbed the sound like a warning. Mahogany desks, polished to a muted sheen, reflected the overhead fluorescence in narrow white bands. Cameras lined the back wall like a silent jury, lenses trained forward, waiting for the inevitable moment when politics would bend into spectacle. Staffers whispered in clipped tones, exchanging last-minute notes and revised talking points. It was a morning built on tension, one assembled, layer by layer, over 3 prior weeks of subpoenas, late-night depositions, and quiet refusals to clarify key timelines. Ivanka Trump sat at the witness table already composed, hands resting lightly atop the binder prepared for her by counsel. She wore an expression of controlled calm, as if she had rehearsed it in a mirror until every micro-movement felt unshakable. Her jaw didn't clench. Her pulse didn't rise. At least, not visibly. She looked like someone convinced she could handle whatever questions came her way. But to her immediate left, Representative Jasmine Crockett studied her with the analytical stillness of someone who didn't believe that for a moment. Crockett's presence in this special, bipartisan oversight session had been unusual from the start. Temporarily reassigned by House leadership to cross-committee constitutional review, she carried with her a reputation for precision, both in legal interpretation and in the way she dismantled evasive testimony without raising her voice. In the weeks leading up to this hearing, staffers had whispered that if any witness underestimated her, they wouldn't do so twice. The hearing concerned a chain of advisory communications allegedly directing federal discretionary funds toward projects not authorized under the Appropriations Act for the fiscal year. The documents were thin, too thin, and riddled with annotations lacking signatures, dates, or procedural certifications. What mattered today was determining the origin of those notes, whether they had influenced federal agencies, and whether anyone had crossed the constitutional boundary between influence and authority. The chair opened with formalities, roll call, oath administration, procedural reminders about perjury. The room shifted into its disciplined rhythm, papers shuffling like soft static under the microphones. Ivanka offered her opening statement in a steady, modulated voice. She emphasized cooperation, transparency, and her belief that any communication sent under my name was strictly advisory recommendations, consistent with permitted channels and submitted in good faith. Her counsel nodded approvingly. But across the table, Crockett didn't blink. Every fluorescent light above cast a vertical glint across the polished witness table, illuminating the thin stack of emails in Crockett's folder. She had spent nights studying them, mapping timestamps, phone logs, and internal routing patterns. Something didn't line up, something about the speed with which certain directives had moved from advisory suggestion to operational request. She had seen bureaucratic machinery operate for years, and this acceleration wasn't natural. It was engineered. The first 30 minutes passed with methodical questioning from other committee members, calm, procedural, predictable. Queries about workflow, about advisory channels, about who had access to what communication systems. Ivanka answered them evenly. She maintained a steady posture, shoulders lifted just enough to project confidence without arrogance. But the equilibrium didn't last. Crockett leaned toward her microphone, the soft click drawing the room's attention. A camera flash struck the back wall, dissolving into white haze for a brief second before settling again. She spoke calmly, the cadence slow enough to draw every ear toward her table. "Ms. Trump," she began, "before I continue, I want to ensure we're working from the same understanding. You stated that all advisory notes sent under your name were merely suggestions, yes?" Ivanka nodded, confident. "Correct, Congresswoman." Crockett's expression didn't change, but the silence that followed carried a different weight, thick, anticipatory, analytical. The kind of silence that suggested something underneath the floorboards of this testimony was about to shift. In that instant, before any accusation or tension formally surfaced, the room sensed it, the subtle tilt in momentum, the faint tremor beneath a witness's carefully structured confidence. And yet, the real crack hadn't happened. Not yet. But the silence wasn't over yet. For the first few minutes, the questioning moved with the practiced calm of a litigation warm-up. Senators studied their notes, flipping pages with the soft, deliberate rhythm of people who understood the gravity of the morning but were determined not to reveal it too early. The microphones emitted a low hum, barely audible, like a continuous reminder of the room's surveillance. On the far wall, a red recording light blinked in time with the tension. Senator Alden, known for his restrained manner, began the formal probing. He adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the neat column of inquiries drafted overnight. "Ms. Trump," he said, "I want to revisit the advisory communications dated March 12. Under what authority were these recommendations transmitted to the Department of Housing and Urban Development?" Ivanka folded her hands. "Senator, those were advisory comments based on policy discussions within the executive office. They were not directives." Alden nodded, but not in agreement, only in acknowledgement. "And you familiar," he continued, "with the limitation under Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution prohibiting the expenditure of funds not appropriated by Congress?" "Yes, Senator." "Absolutely." Her voice remained steady. But Crockett, seated only 3 feet away, noticed the fractional shift in Ivanka's breathing, a subtle expansion of the chest followed by a slower exhale. The sign of someone calculating. Senator Ramirez took over next. Her questions came sharper, clipped, each one landing like a deliberate tap against the foundation of Ivanka's testimony. "Did you, at any point, request, or imply, a redirection of discretionary grants without formal review by career officials?" "No, I did not." "You're certain?" "Yes, Senator." Ramirez held the silence for a beat longer than comfort allowed, then scribbled a note in her binder. Her pen clicked twice. On the opposite end of the table, a staffer shifted, the movement echoing faintly against the chamber's marble flooring. Then it was Crockett again. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't change her posture. She simply leaned forward with the precision of someone preparing to align fact with contradiction. "Ms. Trump," she began, "I have a few clarifying questions regarding those advisory notes." Ivanka offered a polite nod. "Of course." Crockett opened her folder and removed a single sheet, sliding it forward with the edge of her index finger. The document, an email chain, was already public, already analyzed, yet somehow still incomplete. Today, Crockett intended to expose the missing piece. "In your statement, you mentioned that these notes were merely recommendations. My question is straightforward. Were any of these recommendations forwarded with what internal staff refer to as expedited tags?" Ivanka hesitated, but only for half a second. "I'm not aware of any expedited tags used under my name." Crockett's eyes narrowed, though her face remained calm. "Second question, are you aware that expedited designations automatically trigger agency-level action reviews under 5 U.S.C. Section 3347, even if labeled as advisory?" Ivanka blinked once. "Congresswoman, I would need to review the specifics of that statute." Crockett didn't blink back. "Understood," she said. "Third question, did you authorize any staff member, verbally or in writing, to append an expedited designation to your recommendations?" "No. Absolutely not." The words came too quickly. This time, the shift was visible. Ivanka's hands tightened around the edge of the binder, her knuckles faintly whitening. It lasted only a moment, but the cameras caught it, the journalists noticed, the senators exchanged small, knowing glances. Crockett lifted her final sheet but did not reveal it yet. "Fourth question, Ms. Trump, if I present evidence that these expedited tags originated from your office, will you maintain that they were unauthorized?" Ivanka swallowed. Congresswoman, I would need to see that evidence." The room stilled, sensing the trajectory bending away from Ivanka's control. Crockett paused, allowing the air to thicken just enough to make every heartbeat in the chamber feel louder. She did not reveal the document. Not yet. Because the unraveling was only beginning. The chamber's oxygen seemed to thin as Crockett placed the unrevealed sheet beside her elbow, deliberately leaving it face down. The choice was strategic. Nothing raises tension in a hearing faster than a document everyone can see but no one can read. Even the cameras adjusted, whirring softly as operators tightened their framing. The witnesses, the senators, the press, they all leaned in, if not physically, then mentally. Senator Alden resumed the floor, guided by a new thread of unease. "Ms. Trump," he said with unusual sharpness, This committee has received internal memos from 3 agencies indicating that your advisory notes were treated as expedited operational requests. If verified, that would elevate these communications beyond permissible informal influence. Ivanka's chin lifted slightly, defensive posture. Senator, with respect, agencies may have misinterpreted the tone or urgency of my language. That does not imply I issued directives. Crockett noted the phrasing. Tone. Urgency. Soft admissions disguised as soft corrections. Senator Ramirez leaned into her microphone. Let's be precise. Under the Federal Advisory Committee Act, Section 5(b)(2), any advisory communication that is reasonably construed as directive must follow disclosure, logging, and procedural clearance. None of which occurred. Ivanka blinked twice, slowly, as though buying herself a second to reset. I understand the statute, Senator, she replied, but my communications were suggestions meant to streamline policy outcomes. On the far-right press table, a correspondent scribbled the phrase streamline policy outcomes twice, underlining it. They knew what Crockett already understood. Witnesses under pressure tend to reveal more in the soft language than in the hard answers. Crockett finally lifted her sheet. Carefully. Methodically. The paper slid against the wood with a soft rasp, like a match being struck without flame. I'd like to enter this timestamp analysis into the record, she said. She passed it to the clerk, who carried it to the senators. The document contained a timeline, emails, forwarding logs, back-channel notes, stitched into a sequence that made the supposed suggestions look more like triggers. Worse, the triggers aligned with internal agency actions taken within 90 minutes of receiving her emails. Alden adjusted his glasses. This appears to show your office using an internal code, XR3. Crockett nodded. XR3 is used inside the executive office when an item should be prioritized ahead of standard review, typically by career staff. Under 17 CFR Section 200.49, that designation is treated as an advisory escalation with de facto operational impact. Ivanka's lips parted, just slightly. Enough for the room to see the calculation happening behind her eyes. With respect, Congresswoman, she said, I have never used or authorized an XR3 designation. Crockett didn't take her gaze off Ivanka. Then the committee must assume one of 2 possibilities: either someone in your office used the designation without your knowledge, or the designation originated from you. This time, the silence was heavier, weighted, almost metallic. A camera shutter snapped twice. Counsel shifted beside Ivanka, placing a firm hand on her forearm, urging caution without words. Ramirez interjected, her tone cutting. Ms. Trump, can you explain why one of your advisory notes, marked XR03, resulted in an immediate reallocation of $22.4 million from a competitive grant pool? Funds that, under the Appropriations Act for that fiscal year, required congressional approval before any redirection. Ivanka's voice shook, barely, but undeniably. I would need clarity from the agencies involved. That allocation was not my decision. Alden leaned forward. But the trigger was your communication. And this timeline, your office's timeline, aligns with the reallocation. Ivanka held her breath. Everyone saw it. Her fingers pressed into the binder again, the skin around her knuckles tightening like drawn string. Crockett lifted a second sheet, this one with highlighted sections. And this, she said calmly, is a supplemental memo suggesting that your office advised bypassing standard review procedures citing an executive urgency. No signature. No routing code. Just your name in the metadata. Ivanka's eyes flicked downward. A tell. A break. A moment of doubt cracking through a rehearsed exterior. Crockett watched it happen. Because she knew what was coming next. The document would only be the prelude. The collapse had not arrived. Not yet. But every second was pulling the chamber closer. The room had been tense before, but now it felt surgical. Focused. Every chair stilled. Every camera fixed. The air pressed inward, heavy with the weight of an impending rupture. Crockett rested her fingertips against the table, steady and unmoved, while Ivanka Trump shifted her binder half an inch closer as though proximity to paper could soften reality. Senator Alden gestured for Crockett to proceed. And that was when the moment, the one the nation would replay for weeks, began. Ivanka exhaled sharply, leaned toward her microphone, and said words that would detonate the hearing's equilibrium. With all due respect, Congresswoman, your misunderstanding of procedural authority is showing. A condescending smile. A thin, dismissive tilt of the head. And then one more line, the one that changed everything. Perhaps if you had more experience with actual governance, you'd know how these communications work. It took exactly 47 seconds for the comment to collapse the scaffolding of her testimony. 47 seconds of silence, shifting weight, legal recalculations, and political disbelief. Second 1 to 5, a soft gasp rippled across the press bench. Senator Ramirez froze mid-note. Ivanka's counsel closed his eyes, slowly, painfully, realizing the magnitude of the misstep. Second 6 to 10, Crockett didn't blink. She simply leaned forward, folding her hands with calm precision. Her stare held no anger, only the sharp, cold recognition of opportunity. Second 11 to 16, one camera operator whispered, "Oh no," under his breath as he tightened his focus. The red recording light seemed almost brighter now. Second 17 to 24, Crockett clicked her microphone on. The click echoed louder than before, reverberating like a gavel strike. Second 25 to 32, Ivanka swallowed. Her earlier confidence evaporated, replaced with the stiff composure of someone who suddenly realized they had insulted the one person in the room holding the most damaging evidence. Second 33 to 40, Crockett lifted the flagged memo and the XR3 routing analysis, sliding them forward until they sat directly in Ivanka's line of sight. Second 41 to 47, Crockett spoke. "Ms. Trump, let me clarify my misunderstanding. Under Article 1, Section 9, Congress, and only Congress, controls appropriated funds. Under the Federal Advisory Committee Act, any communication from an unelected advisor that causes federal action is treated as directive influence, even if wrapped in polite language. And under 5 U.S.C. Section 3347, expedited designations, like the XR3 tags originating from your office, automatically initiate operational review." Every word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Crockett continued, voice steady, unshaken. "So here is my question, and I would appreciate an answer grounded in your claimed expertise. How does a person with actual governance experience explain bypassing statutory review procedures, triggering agency action, and reallocating $22.4 million in violation of the Appropriations Clause?" Ivanka blinked, once, twice, her breath catching. She opened her mouth but no sound came. Her throat tightened visibly. Her fingers trembled against the binder, the white of her knuckles now unmistakable. Crockett didn't relent. "And please, Ms. Trump, do not refer to this committee's constitutional oversight as a misunderstanding. We wrote the statutes you are now attempting to reinterpret." A tremor ran down Ivanka's arm as she attempted to straighten her papers. She failed. The page slipped, fluttering sideways. The microphones captured the faint shake in her exhale. A telltale sign of collapse. Alden broke the silence, his tone clinical. "Ms. Trump, do you have an answer to the Congresswoman's question?" Ivanka inhaled sharply but couldn't form a coherent response. Her voice broke on the first syllable. She shut her eyes, bracing against the magnitude of her misstep. Counsel reached toward her elbow again, an unspoken plea to stop talking. But the damage was already done. For 47 seconds, America had watched competence unravel. And the reverberation was just beginning. But the fallout hadn't arrived. Not yet. The hearing adjourned for a brief recess, but the chamber's energy did not disperse. It clung to the marble floors, to the wooden banisters, to the cold metal of the microphone still buzzing faintly. Staffers scrambled toward the hallways, carrying stacks of notes like paramedics rushing from a crash site. Flashbulbs erupted in sharp bursts as journalists pushed forward, desperate to capture the expression on Ivanka Trump's face when she realized the moment had gone national. By the time she stepped away from the witness table, the 47 seconds had already escaped into the bloodstream of the country. News alerts hit phones first. Then social feeds. Then the networks. Within minutes, the hearing room became a character in a narrative now unfolding across the US, a narrative Ivanka could no longer steer. NBC broke in with a blunt headline, 47 seconds of silence, Ivanka Trump stumbles under constitutional questioning. Cable news anchors spoke in tones normally reserved for war briefings and Supreme Court decisions. One legal analyst on CNN leaned forward with disbelief. Constitutional scholars are already saying this rivaled the most devastating takedown since Watergate. This wasn't political disagreement. This was a statutory collapse. Another segment on PBS aired footage of the exact moment Ivanka's composure failed. Slow motion. The camera zoomed into the tremor in her fingers, the widening of her eyes, the incredulous stillness of Jasmine Crockett. A Washington Post correspondent described it even more starkly. For 47 seconds, America saw what happens when polished confidence meets statutory reality. Crockett, meanwhile, quietly exited through a staff hallway, avoiding the escalating media frenzy. Her stride remained even, controlled, though aides noticed a small exhale, exhaustion rather than triumph. She understood the gravity of what had just occurred. Hearings were not theater to her, they were boundaries, and today one had been crossed. Back in the main corridor, clusters of reporters waited for Ivanka. Microphones stretched out like an iron forest. Ms. Trump, do you stand by your earlier comments toward Representative Crockett? Will you clarify your authority under Article 1? Were you aware of the XR3 designations? Is the White House responding? Did you violate the Appropriations Clause? Ivanka said nothing. Her counsel steered her through the noise, his grip firm, his expression drawn tight with assessment and damage control. Silence was now their only viable strategy. Inside newsrooms, editors huddled around large screens replaying the exchange. At MSNBC, a former DOJ official explained the legal stakes if those XR3 tags originated from her office, that elevates this beyond human error. It becomes a question of unauthorized executive influence. It becomes potentially unlawful. At Fox News, commentators debated the broader implications. One host remarked, even if these were mistakes, the Appropriations Clause isn't forgiving. It's rigid. Congress controls the purse, always. Meanwhile, hashtags surged, #47 seconds, #Crockett strikes back, #appropriations collapse. Online forums lit up with side-by-side comparisons of historical congressional meltdowns. Ivanka's was already being ranked among them. By sunset, late-night anchors were previewing tomorrow's headlines. Newspapers drafted front-page spreads, each one focusing on the same moment, the look on Ivanka's face when her own words trapped her. But the real fallout, the political, legal, and institutional repercussions, had only begun to take shape. Inside the Capitol, a senior committee staffer slid a sealed envelope onto Senator Alden's desk. It contained a preliminary recommendation for a formal inquiry into potential violations of federal advisory procedural law. Alden didn't open it yet. He simply tapped it once with his index finger and said, "This is going to get worse before it gets clearer." And he was right. Because the storm was still gathering strength. And the reckoning had not yet arrived. The chamber had emptied, but its imprint lingered like a shadow refusing to dissipate. Chairs were tucked in, microphones silent, yet the echoes of 47 seconds of legal and personal rupture still vibrated across the polished floors. Even the fluorescent lights seemed dimmer, as if the building itself recognized the magnitude of what had unfolded. Staffers moved quietly, avoiding one another's gaze, aware that the public narrative had already overtaken the physical reality of the hearing room. Jasmine Crockett, seated in her office with a muted light streaming through half-closed blinds, reviewed the transcripts once more. Every exchange, every hesitation, every clipped word had been catalogued in her mind, analyzed for constitutional and procedural accuracy. She wasn't celebrating. She never did. Today's moment was a reaffirmation of the system, law, procedure, and accountability mattered more than ego or spectacle. She leaned back and exhaled slowly. Ivanka Trump, meanwhile, had retreated into private council discussions. Her office, once bustling with confident aides, now carried the hush of containment. Legal advisers outlined potential inquiries under the Federal Advisory Committee Act and cited previous precedent regarding de facto directive influence. Every clause, every code, every federal procedural nuance was being dissected. She knew, viscerally, that the XR3 memo, the misapplied urgency, and the dismissive remark toward Crockett had converged into a moment of irreversible exposure. One slip, 47 seconds, and the cascade of consequences could not be reversed. Across the nation, commentators were still replaying the breakdown. Social feeds posted frame-by-frame analyses. Law professors highlighted the constitutional stakes, violations of the Appropriations Clause, Section 9, procedural missteps under 5 U.S.C. Section 3347, and the gray zone of executive influence versus statutory compliance. Editors compared this hearing to historical moments of congressional oversight, Nixon-era Watergate, the Iran-Contra hearings, but noted the unique fusion of political theater and hyper-realistic legal collapse. In Capitol hallways, whispers circulated about forthcoming investigations. Subpoenas, internal audits, and formal reviews loomed. Congressional aides began drafting letters to multiple oversight committees. Every movement carried the weight of legal precedent and the anticipation of public scrutiny. Crockett's office, in contrast, was quiet, her focus now on preparing detailed briefings for colleagues who sought her insight into procedural integrity and accountability. The personal dimension remained undeniable. Ivanka's career trajectory, meticulously constructed, had encountered an institutional wall. Law and procedure do not bend for reputation or connections. And for Crockett, the moment underscored the quiet power of preparation, knowledge, and restraint. She had not shouted. She had not vilified. She had, with precision, allowed the statutes, the memos, and the constitutional text to speak for themselves. As dusk fell over Washington, the chamber's grand doors closed on a day that would echo far beyond its walls. Staffers, witnesses, and senators alike walked past marble floors and muted chandeliers, carrying the residue of accountability, the weight of legal rigor, and the moral reflection that the system, however flawed, still demanded compliance. Some careers end in scandal. Some careers end in silence. And in the corridors of power, where light flickers across polished wooden law books gather dust, the echoes of 47 seconds linger, a quiet testament to the intersection of ambition, procedure, and the unyielding demand for constitutional fidelity.